The morning her husband's coffin sank into the red clay of the Wyoming hillside, Eva Sawyer swore to the empty sky that she would never again depend on a man for her survival. And it was that very vow which, 4 months later, brought a stranger with kind eyes riding straight into her forge yard with a proposition that would change everything. The year was 1878, and the town of Split Creek, Wyoming Territory, sat like a scattering of gray bones along the banks of a river that never seemed to decide whether it wanted to be a creek or a proper waterway. Eva had come to Split Creek 6 years earlier as a bride of 22, following her husband Daniel Sawyer west from Ohio, because he had a trade that people always needed, and a blacksmith, he told her, could build a life anywhere there were horses to shoe and wagon wheels to mend. He had not been wrong about the trade. He had simply been wrong about how long he would live to practice it. The influenza had taken him in the cruelest month, February, when the wind howled down from the bighorns and froze the water barrel solid every night. Eva had nursed him for 11 days, wringing out cloths in water she had to break ice to draw, and on the 12th day she had closed his eyes with her own trembling fingers and understood, in the marrow-deep way that grief teaches a person, that she was now alone in a territory that did not particularly care whether a woman without a husband lived or starved. She was 28 years old, childless, and in possession of a forge, an anvil, 3 horses, a modest house of clapboard and stone, and debts that the previous winter's slow business had left unpaid. The townsmen had come by in the weeks after the funeral, hats in their hands, offering condolences, and more than a few of them offering marriage with an indecent haste that told Eva exactly what they were really after. She had refused them all. She would rather starve with her pride than marry for convenience a second time, having married the first time for love and lost it to a cruel winter. What she had not expected, what no one could have expected, was that she would learn to work the forge herself. It began out of necessity. A rancher named Otis Prout rode in with a lame horse 2 weeks after Daniel's burial, having not yet heard the news, and when Eva told him her husband was dead, he looked at her with something between pity and irritation and asked where he might find another smith, since Split Creek was a 2-day ride from the next one in Buffalo. "I can shoe the horse myself," Eva had said, surprising them both. She had watched Daniel work for 6 years. She had held horses steady while he nailed shoes, had pumped the bellows on cold mornings when his hands were too stiff, had listened to him explain the trade the way some men explain scripture, with a reverence for the craft that had made her fall in love with him twice over, once for the man and once for the work of his hands. She did not know, in that moment with Otis Prout's lame mare standing in her yard, whether she could actually do it. But she knew she could not let the man ride on to Buffalo and tell the whole territory that Daniel Sawyer's widow was helpless. It took her most of the afternoon, and her hands blistered raw despite the leather gloves, and the horse shied twice badly enough that she nearly lost a finger to a kick. But by sundown the mare stood shod on all 4 feet, and Otis Prout paid her the going rate without comment, though his eyes lingered on the forge and on her soot-streaked face with a kind of grudging respect. Word spread, as it does in small towns. Some of it was unkind, whispers about a woman doing man's work, about how it was unnatural and probably a sign that Daniel Sawyer's widow had gone strange with grief. But some of the ranchers, the practical ones who cared more about a good shoe than about propriety, kept bringing her their horses and their broken plow blades and their wagon wheels, because the truth was that Eva Sawyer, after those first difficult weeks, was good at it. She had an eye for the heat of the metal, a patience with the hammer that Daniel himself had sometimes lacked, and a stubbornness that meant she would work until a job was done right, even if it took her twice as long as it would have taken a man with more strength in his arms. By the time summer arrived, Eva had built something that resembled a living, though a precarious one, and she told herself that this was enough, that she did not need anything more than the forge and the work and the small, hard-won respect of the town. Then, On a hot morning in late June, Matthew Warren rode into Split Creek leading a string of 6 horses that needed shoes and a business proposition that would upend the careful, solitary life she had built. He was not from Split Creek. That much was obvious from the moment he swung down off his horse, a lean bay gelding, and stood in her yard looking around with the particular alertness of a man used to sizing up unfamiliar places. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, tall, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat, and a way of standing that suggested both confidence and a certain watchfulness, as though he had learned the hard way not to trust a place until it proved trustworthy. "You the smith?" he asked, and there was no scorn in it, only a plain question. "I am," Eva said, wiping her hands on her leather apron. "Eva Sawyer, what do you need?" "Matthew Warren," he said, touching his hat brim. "I've got 6 horses need shoeing, and I was told in Buffalo that Split Creek had a good smith. Didn't figure on the smith being a woman, but I reckon a good shoe is a good shoe regardless of who's swinging the hammer." There was something in the way he said it, plain and unbothered, that struck Eva as different from the men of Split Creek, who either avoided her forge entirely out of some wounded sense that a woman smith was an affront to the natural order, or who came only because they had no other choice and made their disapproval known in small, needling comments. Matthew Warren simply looked at her the way he might look at any smith, waiting to be shown whether she was competent. 6 horses is a full day's work," Eva said. "I charge by the shoe, same as any smith." "You in a hurry?" "Not especially," Matthew said. "I'm passing through, driving these horses to sell in Cheyenne, but a day here or there won't ruin me. I'd rather have the shoes done right than done fast." Eva nodded, already moving toward the first horse, a rangy chestnut with a nervous eye. "Then you've come to the right forge. Tie them up along the rail there, and I'll start with this one." Matthew Warren spent that first day mostly watching, which unsettled Eva more than she wanted to admit. She was used to being watched with suspicion, or with the leering curiosity of men who thought a woman blacksmith was some kind of novelty act. Matthew's watching was different. He watched the way a craftsman watches another craftsman, noting the angle of her hammer strikes, the way she read the color of the heated iron, the calm competence with which she held a nervous horse's leg steady between her knees. "You didn't learn that from a book," he said at one point, when she had just finished shaping a shoe for the second horse, adjusting it against the animal's hoof with quick, sure motions. "I learned it from my husband," Eva said, and there was no self-pity in her voice, only fact. "He was the smith here for 6 years. He died this past February." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and it did not sound like the rote condolence she had heard so many times from the men of Split Creek. It sounded like he meant it. "Thank you," Eva said, and returned to her work. They did not speak much more that first day, but there was an ease in the silence between them that Eva found herself noticing, the way she might notice an unfamiliar bird call in the trees, something worth paying attention to precisely because it was different from what she expected. Matthew helped her without being asked, holding the more difficult horses steady, fetching water when she needed it, and in the late afternoon he built up the fire in her forge without a word when he saw her flagging, careful to keep it at the temperature she wanted rather than simply making it hotter out of some misguided notion of helpfulness. "You've worked a forge before," Eva said, noticing this. "My father was a smith back in Missouri," Matthew said. "I grew up around one, though I never took to the trade myself. I went another direction." "What direction was that?" Matthew hesitated just slightly in a way that made Eva curious. "Cattle mostly, droving ranch work. I've done some scouting too, for the army back some years ago, before I decided I preferred horses to soldiers." He said it lightly, but there was a shadow behind the words that suggested a history he was not eager to unpack for a stranger, however kind her eyes. By the time the sun set on that first day, 4 of the 6 horses stood freshly shod, and Eva found herself, against her own careful vow of independence, looking forward to the next day's work more than she had looked forward to anything since Daniel's death. Matthew stayed at the small boarding house run by a widow named Constance Abernathy, and the next morning he arrived at Eva's forge with 2 cups of coffee from the boarding house kitchen, one of which he handed to her without ceremony. "Figured you might not have had breakfast yet," he said. "I hadn't," Eva admitted, taking the cup. It was a small kindness, but it landed with a weight that surprised her, because it had been so long since anyone had thought to do such a small thing for her without expecting something in return. They worked through the second day much as they had the first, but the conversation came more easily now. Eva learned that Matthew Warren was 33 years old, unmarried, that he had left Missouri at 19 after his father's forge burned down in a fire that took his father's life along with it, and that he had spent the years since drifting through cattle work and scouting, and more recently buying and selling horses, which he found suited his restless nature better than settling in one place ever had. "Don't you get tired of it?" Eva asked. "Never staying anywhere?" Matthew considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to everything she was noticing. "I used to think I liked it," he said. "The moving. Never had to answer to anybody, never had to watch a place become a grave for the things I cared about. But I'll admit, the last couple years, it started to feel more like running than choosing." "Running from what?" "I couldn't tell you exactly," Matthew said. "Maybe just running from standing still long enough to figure out what I actually want." Eva said nothing to that, but she found herself thinking about it long after he had ridden out that evening to check on the other horses he had left grazing outside of town. The 6 horses took 3 full days to shoe properly, given Eva's insistence on doing the work right rather than fast, and by the time the last shoe was nailed into place, something had shifted between them. Subtle but unmistakable, the way the light shifts in late afternoon without announcing the change but leaving everything different regardless. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Eva was banking the forge fire for the night, Matthew lingered in the yard instead of heading back toward the boarding house. "I've got a proposition for you," he said. Eva looked up, wary in the particular way she had learned to be wary of men's propositions since becoming a widow. "What kind of proposition?" "I'm taking these horses to Cheyenne to sell, like I said," Matthew began. "But I've been thinking, watching you work these past 3 days, that there's more opportunity here in Split Creek than you might realize. A smith who can shoe horses is valuable. A smith who can also trade horses, buy low from ranchers who don't want the trouble of driving them to Cheyenne themselves and sell higher there, could do a good deal better than just shoeing." "I don't have the capital for horse trading," Eva said. "I can barely keep the forge running as it is." "I do have the capital," Matthew said. "What I don't have is a place to work from, a base. I've been thinking I might settle somewhere instead of always drifting. Split Creek seems as good a place as any, and better than most, on account of the smith here being the best I've come across in some years." Eva felt her guard rising even as something in her chest loosened at the compliment. "You're proposing a business partnership?" "I am," Matthew said. "I bring the capital and the horse sense, you bring the forge and the trade skills, and we split the profits fair. I'd need to rent space near your forge, maybe build a small corral, but I wouldn't be looking to interfere with your business, only to build alongside it." It was, Eva had to admit, a sensible proposition and one that did not ask anything improper of her, only a business arrangement between 2 people with complementary skills. And yet she found herself hesitating, not because the offer was unreasonable, but because some part of her recognized that letting Matthew Warren build something alongside her, literally and figuratively, was a kind of risk that went beyond mere commerce. "I'll think on it," she said. "That's fair," Matthew said, and touched his hat brim before walking off toward the boarding house, leaving Eva alone in the yard with the dying light of the forge fire and a great deal to think about. She thought about it for 3 days, during which Matthew occupied himself around town, evidently deciding to wait for her answer rather than pressing the matter. She noticed him at the Mercantile, exchanging pleasant conversation with old Silas Whitfield, who ran the place. She noticed him at the little church on Sunday, sitting near the back, and though she herself had not attended church since Daniel's funeral, she found herself wondering whether Matthew Warren was a praying man, and what he might pray for. On the fourth day, she rode out to find him at the makeshift camp where he had been keeping the remaining horses, on a stretch of open grass just beyond the edge of town. "I've thought about your proposition," she said, dismounting, "and I'll agree to it on one condition. This is still my forge. My name stays on the sign, and any decisions about how the smithing work is done, I make those decisions. You handle the horse trading, and I'll shoe the horses you buy and sell, and we split fair as you said. But I'm not interested in a partnership where I end up working for you instead of with you." Matthew smiled then, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face, softened the watchfulness into something warmer. "That's exactly the arrangement I was hoping for, Mrs. Sawyer. I've got no interest in taking anything from you, only in building something alongside you." They shook hands on it, her palm calloused from years at the anvil, his roughened from years of rope and rain, and Eva told herself firmly that this was a business arrangement and nothing more, even as she felt the warmth of his hand linger in her memory long after he had ridden back to town. The partnership began in earnest that summer, and it did not take long for Eva to see that Matthew Warren was a man of his word. He built a small corral adjacent to her forge yard, paying for the lumber himself and doing much of the construction with his own hands, occasionally accepting help from a few of the town's boys who were eager to earn a few coins. He rode out to the surrounding ranches and struck deals with ranchers who had more horses than they knew what to do with, buying young stock cheap and bringing them back to Split Creek where Eva would examine them, shoe the ones that needed it, and help judge which animals were sound enough to fetch a good price in Cheyenne. It was hard work, harder in some ways than the solitary blacksmithing had been, because now there was more of everything, more horses, more transactions, more travel for Matthew as he made his runs to Cheyenne to sell what they had accumulated. But it was also, Eva found, deeply satisfying in a way the lonely months after Daniel's death had not been. She was building something, and for the first time since her husband's death, she was not building it alone. The town noticed, of course. Split Creek was small enough that everyone noticed everything, and the sight of Matthew Warren spending so much time at the widow Sawyer's forge did not go unremarked. Constance Abernathy, who ran the boarding house where Matthew still lodged, took it upon herself one afternoon to corner Eva at the Mercantile and inquire, with the studied casualness of a woman who considers gossip a civic duty, whether there was anything romantic developing between the smith and the horse trader. "We're business partners, Mrs. Abernathy," Eva said, more sharply than she intended. "Nothing more." "Of course, dear," Constance said, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the kind but let the matter drop for the moment. If Eva was honest with herself in the quiet hours after the forge fire had died down and she lay alone in the bed she had once shared with Daniel, she could admit that her feelings toward Matthew Warren had grown more complicated than a simple business partnership warranted. She found herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with horses or profits. The way he laughed, low and genuine, at something one of the ranch hands said. The careful, unhurried way he handled a frightened colt, speaking to it in a low voice until it calmed. The manner in which he always, without fail, thanked her for her work at the end of a long day, as though her competence was not something to be taken for granted, but something worth acknowledging every single time. She told herself these were simply the observations of a business partner, but she did not entirely believe her own reasoning. The turning point, or at least the first turning point, came on an evening in late August, when a summer storm rolled in off the mountains with more violence than Split Creek had seen in years. The wind came first, tearing at the canvas covering the corral, and then the rain, sheets of it, and finally lightning that split the sky in jagged white cracks that lit up the whole valley for terrifying instants. Eva had been in her house when the storm hit, but she remembered, with a jolt of alarm, that she had left several horses in the corral that were particularly valuable, recently purchased stock, that Matthew had not yet had the chance to move to more secure pasture. She pulled on her boots and a coat and ran out into the storm, the rain instantly soaking through to her skin, thunder rolling so close she felt it in her chest. Matthew was already there, she found, having come from the boarding house at the first sign of trouble, wrestling with the gate of the corral where the horses had worked themselves into a panic. One of them, a valuable young stallion, having gotten a leg caught in a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. "Eva, stay back," Matthew shouted over the storm, but she was already moving toward the frightened animal, her years of experience with panicked horses overriding any instinct toward self-preservation. Together, soaked to the bone and half-blinded by rain, they worked to free the stallion's leg, Eva speaking low and steady to the animal while Matthew worked the tangled fence wire loose with his bare hands, cutting himself badly enough that blood mixed with rainwater ran down his fingers. Lightning struck a tree at the edge of the property with a crack like the world splitting open, and both horses and humans startled, but Eva held firm to the stallion's halter. And finally, the leg came free. They herded the horses into the more secure shelter of the barn Matthew had built, and once the animals were settled, Eva turned to find Matthew leaning against the barn wall, breathing hard, blood still welling from the cut on his hand. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his hand before he could protest. "It's not bad," Matthew said, though his face suggested otherwise. "Let me see." Eva examined the cut in the dim lantern light, her fingers gentle despite the roughness of her own hands, calloused from years at the anvil. The cut was deep but clean, and she knew from years of tending to Daniel's minor forge injuries exactly what needed to be done. "It needs stitching." "Come to the house." Matthew followed her through the rain, and in the warm light of her kitchen, Eva cleaned and stitched the wound with steady hands, the same hands that had, moments before, held a panicked stallion still through the fury of a mountain storm. Matthew watched her work with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and a deeper, quieter emotion that made her fingers tremble slightly as she tied off the last stitch. "You didn't have to come out in that storm," Matthew said quietly once the wound was bandaged. "Could have gotten yourself killed." "So could you," Eva said. "And I wasn't about to let a good stallion drown in a fence, or let my business partner bleed to death from stubbornness." Matthew laughed, softly, and the sound of it in the small kitchen, with the storm still raging outside and the lantern casting warm shadows across his face, did something to Eva's carefully guarded heart that she could not immediately name. "Eva," Matthew said, and his voice had grown serious, "I want to say something, and I hope you'll hear me out before you decide whether to be angry with me for saying it." "Say it," Eva said, though her heart had begun to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. "These past 2 months, working alongside you, I've come to admire you more than I know how to properly say. Not just your skill at the forge, though that's considerable. It's the way you've built something out of loss that would have broken most people. It's your stubbornness and your fairness, and the way you treat every horse and every person who comes through that forge yard with the same steady respect, whether they deserve it or not. I came to Split Creek intending to sell some horses and move on, same as I've done in a dozen towns before this one. I find now that I don't want to move on. I want to stay if you'll have me stay, not just as a business partner but as something more if you're willing to consider it." Eva was quiet for a long moment, the rain drumming against the roof, her heart caught somewhere between the fear of losing what she had built and the fear of losing what she was only now beginning to realize she wanted. "I loved my husband," she said finally. "I loved him deeply, and losing him nearly broke me. I don't know that I have it in me to risk that kind of loss again. I can't promise you I'll never leave this earth before you're ready for me to," Matthew said gently. "No one can promise that, not to anyone, not ever. All I can promise is that for as long as I'm given, I would spend every day of it trying to be worthy of standing beside you. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm only asking you to know how I feel, so that whatever happens between us happens with both of us seeing clearly. Eva found to her own surprise that she was crying, though whether from grief or hope or some combination of both, she could not have said. "I need time," she said. "Then you'll have it," Matthew said. "All the time you need." "I'm not going anywhere, Eva Sawyer, not unless you tell me to." He left shortly after, walking back through the last of the storm toward the boarding house, and Eva sat alone in her kitchen for a long while afterward, thinking about Daniel, about the 6 good years they had shared, about the terrible cold February that had taken him, and about the strange, unexpected warmth that had crept into her life in the person of a horse trader who had ridden into her yard with 6 lame horses and somehow, without either of them quite intending it, ridden his way into her heart. The following weeks were quieter between them, not from any coldness but from a kind of careful, mutual patience, as though both of them understood that something important was being decided and that it deserved the proper time to settle. They continued their partnership, continued the work of the forge and the horse trading, but there was a new tenderness in the small interactions between them, in the way Matthew always made sure she had water on hot days, in the way Eva began, without quite realizing she was doing it, to save the best cuts of meat from her modest suppers to share with him when he stayed late helping with a difficult shoeing. It was during this time that trouble arrived in Split Creek, in the form of a man named Elias Bramwell, who had been the town's other significant landowner, and who had, in the months since Daniel's death, made several attempts to purchase Eva's forge property at a price well below its worth, attempts she had refused each time. Bramwell was not a man accustomed to being refused, and as Eva's partnership with Matthew Warren began to flourish, and the forge's fortunes visibly improved, his interest in acquiring the property only intensified, along with his frustration at her continued refusals. Bramwell came to the forge on a September afternoon, dressed in his usual fine clothes that seemed always slightly out of place in the dust and grime of a working smithy, and found Eva alone, Matthew having ridden out that morning to inspect a herd some 15 miles distant. "Mrs. Sawyer," Bramwell said, his tone falsely pleasant in the way Eva had come to recognize as a prelude to something unpleasant. "I understand your little business venture with Mr. Warren has been quite profitable this summer." "It has," Eva said, not pausing in her work, the rhythmic clang of hammer on iron continuing as she shaped a wagon axle. "It occurs to me," Bramwell continued, "that a woman in your position without a husband to protect her interests might find herself vulnerable to certain difficulties. Debts, for instance, that might come due unexpectedly, accidents that might befall valuable livestock. A woman alone has so few protections in a territory like this one." Eva set down her hammer and turned to face him fully, her eyes hard. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Bramwell?" "I would never threaten a lady," Bramwell said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am merely observing that circumstances can be unpredictable, and that a generous offer for your property made now, while circumstances remain favorable, might prove wiser than waiting for circumstances to become less favorable." "I've told you before and I'll tell you again," Eva said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "This forge is not for sale. Not to you, not at any price. This land is mine and I intend to keep it and to keep building the life I've built here. If you have some notion that intimidation will change my mind, you're mistaken about the kind of woman you're dealing with." Bramwell's smile faded into something colder. "We shall see, Mrs. Sawyer," he said, and turned to leave, but paused at the yard's edge to add, almost as an afterthought, "Do give my regards to Mr. Warren when he returns. I understand he's become quite attached to your little operation here. Would be a shame if that attachment brought him more trouble than he bargained for." Eva did not tell Matthew about the visit right away, not wanting to burden him with a threat that might amount to nothing more than an angry man's bluster. But 3 nights later, the bluster proved to be more than bluster, when Eva woke to the smell of smoke and the crackling roar of fire. The hay barn where Matthew stored feed for the horses had been set ablaze, and by the time Eva had roused herself and run outside, flames were already licking up the barn's wooden walls, casting a hellish orange light across the yard. Matthew, who had taken to sleeping in a small room adjacent to the corral to better watch over the horses, was already fighting the fire with a bucket of water drawn from the trough, but the flames were spreading faster than one man with one bucket could manage. The horses! Eva shouted, running toward the corral where the animals were screaming in terror, the fire's light and heat driving them into a panicked frenzy against the fence rails. Together they worked frantically to open the gates and drive the horses to safety, Eva risking a kick or a trampling as she waved her arms and shouted to move the animals away from the burning barn, Matthew doing the same on the opposite side, both of them coughing against the smoke that rolled thick and black across the yard. By the time the horses were safely clear, half the barn had already collapsed into a smoldering ruin, and the feed stores within, along with several saddles and pieces of tack, were lost entirely. Some of the town's men, roused by the light of the fire visible even from the main street, arrived with buckets and shovels to help contain the blaze before it could spread to the forge itself or to Eva's house, and by the time the sun rose, gray and smoke-hazed, the fire was out, but the damage was done. The barn was a total loss, along with a significant portion of their feed stores and equipment. "This wasn't an accident," Matthew said grimly, examining the remains in the early light, finding what looked unmistakably like the remnants of a coal-oil lantern that had been deliberately smashed against the barn's dry wooden wall. "Someone did this on purpose." Eva told him then about Bramwell's visit, about the veiled threats, and watched Matthew's expression darken into something she had not seen from him before, a controlled but unmistakable anger. "I should have told you sooner," Eva said. "I didn't want to worry you over something that might have been nothing more than an angry man's talk." "You should always tell me these things, Eva," Matthew said, and though his voice was firm, there was no anger in it directed at her, only concern. "We're partners. Whatever threatens you or this place threatens both of us now. I mean to see this dealt with properly, and I mean to see Bramwell answer for it, if I can prove he had a hand in this." Proving it, however, was no simple matter. There were no witnesses to the fire's setting, and Bramwell, when confronted by the town's sheriff, a heavy-set man named Boyd Callahan who had a reputation for avoiding trouble whenever possible, simply denied any involvement and pointed out, with a thin smile, that he had been at his own home the entire evening, a fact several of his hired men were quick to confirm. "Without proof, Mrs. Sawyer, Mr. Warren, there's nothing I can do," Sheriff Callahan said, though his tone suggested he did not much care to look harder for proof, given Bramwell's standing in the town and his own disinclination toward conflict with powerful men. Matthew was not satisfied with this, and over the following days he made quiet inquiries around town, eventually learning from a young ranch hand who worked occasionally for Bramwell that one of the man's regular hired men, a rough character named Cole Detrick, had been seen near the Sawyer property on the night of the fire, and had been paid an unusually large sum shortly afterward. Armed with this information, though it was hardly conclusive proof that would satisfy a court, Matthew rode out to confront Bramwell directly, and Eva, despite his insistence that she remain at the forge, rode alongside him, unwilling to let him face the man alone. They found Bramwell on the porch of his large ranch house, and the confrontation that followed was tense but, to Eva's relief, did not turn to violence, though Matthew's voice carried a hard edge she had not heard from him before. "I know what you did, Bramwell," Matthew said, standing his ground as Bramwell's hired men gathered nearby, sensing trouble. "I know Cole Detrick set that fire on your orders, and I know why. You wanted to scare Eva Sawyer off her own land, and you nearly succeeded in burning down her livelihood along with mine. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Warren, without a shred of proof to back it," Bramwell said, though a flicker of something, perhaps unease, crossed his face. I'd be careful about making such claims publicly. A man's reputation is worth defending by whatever means necessary. Is that a threat? Matthew asked, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made Eva's stomach tighten with worry. It's a warning, Mr. Warren, offered in the spirit of friendly caution, Bramwell said. Split Creek is a small town. Accidents happen to those who make too many enemies. I'd think carefully about which side of that equation you and Mrs. Sawyer wish to find yourselves on. Eva stepped forward then, unwilling to let Matthew face this threat alone, or let Bramwell believe she could be so easily frightened. You listen to me, Elias Bramwell, she said, her voice carrying the same steady strength she brought to every hour at her anvil. I have buried a husband. I have built a life from nothing but my own 2 hands and a forge that most people said a woman had no business running. I am not afraid of you, and I am not leaving that land, not for any price you could name, and not for any threat you could make. If anything else happens to that property, I will make certain the whole territory knows exactly what kind of man you are, whether the sheriff finds proof enough to satisfy a courtroom or not. Your reputation, Mr. Bramwell, is a fragile thing, and I have nothing left to lose in tearing it down around you. There was a long, tense silence, broken only by the shuffling of Bramwell's hired men and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Bramwell's composure flickered just slightly at the certainty in Eva's voice, at the recognition, perhaps, that he had misjudged the depth of her resolve. You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Sawyer, Bramwell said finally, his voice tight. I hope that stubbornness serves you well. It has so far, Eva said, and turned her horse back toward town, Matthew following alongside her, and neither of them looked back to see whatever expression crossed Bramwell's face as they rode away. Whether it was Eva's defiant words, or some calculation Bramwell made about the risks of further escalation, or simple cowardice in the face of being named publicly as an arsonist, no further trouble came from that quarter in the weeks that followed. Cole Detrick, the hired man suspected of setting the fire, left Split Creek entirely not long after, taking work elsewhere, and though nothing was ever proven in a court of law, the town's quiet consensus settled firmly against Bramwell, and his standing, already resented by many for his aggressive land dealings, diminished considerably in the months that followed. The barn was rebuilt, this time with Matthew and several of the town's men contributing labor, a barn raising that turned, by its second day, into something almost like a celebration, with Constance Abernathy bringing pies and several of the ranch families bringing their children to play in the yard while the men worked. Eva found herself, watching the community gather around her and Matthew's shared enterprise, feeling something she had not expected to feel again after Daniel's death. A sense of belonging, of being woven into the fabric of a place rather than simply surviving within it. It was on the evening after the barn's completion, as the last of the well-wishers departed and the yard grew quiet under a sky full of stars, that Eva found Matthew sitting alone near the new barn's entrance, and she came to sit beside him without invitation, their shoulders nearly touching. You never gave me your answer, Matthew said quietly, after a long moment of comfortable silence. About what I said that night of the storm. Eva looked up at the stars, thinking of Daniel, of the 6 years they had shared, of the terrible cold February that had ended them. She thought, too, of the past months, of the steady, patient warmth Matthew Warren had brought into her life, not replacing what she had lost, but building something new alongside the memory of it. I think, she said slowly, that I have been afraid these past months that loving you would mean betraying Daniel's memory somehow. That building something new meant that what we had was not enough, was not worthy of being held onto. And now, Matthew asked, his voice gentle. Now I think I understand it differently, Eva said. Daniel gave me 6 good years, and I will always carry that with me, always be grateful for it. But he's gone, Matthew, and I am still here, and I don't think there's any dishonor in a person choosing, when they've been given the chance, to keep living fully rather than only mourning what's been lost. I think Daniel would want that for me. I think he would want me to be happy. And are you? Matthew asked. Happy, I mean." Eva turned to look at him then, at the careful hope in his eyes, at the man who had ridden into her forge yard with 6 lame horses and had, over the course of a summer full of storms and fires and quiet, steady kindness, become someone she could not imagine her life without. "I think I could be," she said. "I think, with you, I could be very happy indeed." Matthew's smile, when it came, was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, slow and warm and full of a light that seemed to Eva, in that moment, brighter than any forge fire she had ever tended. He reached for her hand, calloused fingers intertwining with her own calloused fingers, two people whose hands had been shaped by hard work and harder losses, finding in each other a kind of match that neither had expected but both, it seemed, had needed. "Eva Sawyer," Matthew said softly, "I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day, watching you work that forge like you'd been born to it, stubborn and skilled and utterly unwilling to be anything less than exactly who you are. I would be honored, more honored than I know how to say, if you would consider becoming my wife." Eva felt tears rise, unbidden but not unwelcome, and found herself laughing softly even as she cried. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Matthew Warren, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and searching, under a sky full of Wyoming stars, and Eva felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since February finally, gently, begin to loosen. They married in October in the small church at the edge of town, with the leaves on the cottonwoods turning gold and the air carrying that particular crisp sweetness that comes just before the first frost. The whole town turned out, it seemed, partly out of genuine affection for the couple that had built something remarkable out of a chance meeting over 6 lame horses, and partly, Eva suspected with some amusement, out of curiosity to see the blacksmith widow, finally claimed by the horse trader who had so clearly claimed her heart months before either of them had admitted it aloud. Constance Abernathy cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and declaring to anyone who would listen that she had known, simply known, from the very first week Matthew Warren had lodged at her boarding house, that something significant was developing between him and the widow Sawyer. Even Silas Whitfield closed the mercantile for the afternoon to attend, bringing as a wedding gift a fine set of iron kettle hooks that he had ordered specially from Cheyenne months before, evidently having anticipated this outcome longer than either Eva or Matthew had allowed themselves to hope for it. Eva wore a dress of pale blue that had belonged to her mother, carefully altered and pressed for the occasion, and as she walked down the short aisle of the little church toward Matthew, who stood waiting with an expression of such open joy that it nearly undid her composure entirely, she thought of Daniel, briefly, with love and gratitude rather than grief, a peaceful acknowledgment of a chapter closed rather than a wound reopened. The Reverend, an elderly circuit preacher named Josiah Fenwick, who traveled between several small territorial towns, spoke of new beginnings and of God's grace in bringing together two people who had each known loss and had found in each other a path forward into joy. When he asked Matthew to speak his vows, Matthew's voice, usually so steady and controlled, trembled slightly with emotion as he promised to love and protect and build a life alongside Eva Sawyer for as long as they both should live. And when Eva spoke her own vows in return, she found her voice equally unsteady, full of a happiness so complete it felt almost disorienting after the long, hard months of grief that had preceded it. They did not travel far for their brief wedding trip, Matthew having arranged only a few days away at a modest inn in Buffalo, since neither of them could afford to leave the forge, and the horse business untended for long. But those few days were, Eva would later say, among the happiest of her entire life, full of long walks and quiet conversation, and the particular tenderness of two people building a life together after each had known what it meant to have a life taken away. When they returned to Split Creek, life resumed its familiar rhythms, but changed now in the quiet, permanent way that marriage changes a household. Matthew moved his few belongings from the boarding house into Eva's home, the house she had shared with Daniel, and though there was a brief, tender conversation between them about whether Eva wished to remain in that particular house given its history, she found that she did wish to remain, that the house held good memories alongside the painful ones, and that Matthew's presence within it did not erase Daniel's memory, but rather added a new layer to a home that had room, it turned out, for more than one kind of love across the span of a life. The forge and horse trading business continued to flourish through that winter and into the following spring, and by the time a full year had passed since Matthew had first ridden into Split Creek with his 6 lame horses, the sign above the forge yard had been updated to read Sawyer and Warren, Blacksmithing and Horse Trading, a small but significant testament to the partnership, both in business and in marriage, that the two of them had built. It was in the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after their wedding, that Eva discovered she was expecting their first child, a discovery that filled the household with a joy that seemed, at times, almost too large to contain within the walls of their small home. Matthew, upon hearing the news, had picked Eva up entirely off her feet, spinning her in a circle in the middle of the kitchen despite her laughing protests, and had then immediately begun fretting over whether she ought to continue working at the forge in her condition, a concern Eva firmly and repeatedly dismissed. "I shoed horses through most of my pregnancy with women in this territory who had far harder circumstances than I do," Eva told him, not unkindly but with the same firm practicality that had characterized her approach to every challenge since Daniel's death. "I'll know my own limits, Matthew Warren, and I'll tell you when I need to slow down. Until then, I intend to keep working." She did slow down eventually, as her pregnancy progressed through the summer months, handing off the heaviest work to Matthew and to a young apprentice they had taken on that spring, a boy of 17 named Thomas Bell who showed genuine promise at the trade and who Eva found herself teaching with the same patience Daniel had once shown her. The baby, a boy, was born on a clear October night, almost exactly 2 years after Eva and Matthew's wedding, and they named him Daniel, in honor of the man whose memory had shaped so much of Eva's life before Matthew's arrival, a choice that Matthew had suggested himself, without any trace of jealousy or resentment, understanding fully the significance of honoring the love that had come before their own, without diminishing what they had built together. "He would be glad, I think," Matthew said quietly, holding his newborn son for the first time, "to know that his name carries forward into a family built on the very foundation he helped Eva learn to build. That forge out there, this whole life you've made, so much of it started because of the skills he taught you, the love he gave you. There's no shame in honoring that." Eva, exhausted but glowing with the particular joy of new motherhood, found herself crying again, as she seemed to do rather often during moments of great emotion, though these were unquestionably tears of happiness. 2 years after young Daniel's birth, in 1882, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, for the grace that Eva felt had carried her through the darkest months of her widowhood into the unexpected joy of her new life. Grace was born with her father's dark hair and her mother's steady, watchful eyes, and by the time she was old enough to toddle around the forge yard, she had already developed an evident fascination with the ringing of hammer on anvil, much to her parents' amusement. The town of Split Creek continued to grow through these years, as the territory itself grew, more settlers arriving, more ranches established, and the demand for a skilled forge and reliable horse trading only increased. Eva and Matthew's business became, in time, one of the most respected and prosperous in the region, known not only for the quality of the work, but for the fairness with which they treated every customer, rancher and homesteader alike, regardless of how much business they brought. Elias Bramwell, whose earlier attempts at intimidation had so thoroughly failed, eventually sold much of his land holdings and left the territory some years later, having never fully recovered his standing in a community that had turned decisively against him, once the truth of his character became widely, if unofficially, understood. Eva felt no particular satisfaction in his departure, only a quiet relief that the shadow he had cast over her early independence had finally lifted entirely. Thomas Bell, the apprentice Eva had trained, grew into a fine smith in his own right, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day forge work as Eva's attention turned increasingly toward raising her growing family, though she never fully stepped away from the anvil, teaching her own children, in time, the same skills Daniel had once taught her, passing forward a legacy of craft and resilience that had, quite literally, been forged from the ashes of tremendous loss. By 1885, 7 years after that terrible February which had taken Daniel Sawyer and left Eva a young widow with nothing but a forge and a fierce determination not to be broken by circumstance, the Warren household had grown to include a third child, another son they named Peter, and the family had become, by any measure, one of the most settled and respected in all of Split Creek. On a warm evening in early June of that year, Eva stood in the doorway of the forge, watching Matthew teach young Daniel, now 6 years old, how to properly hold a small hammer, guiding the boy's hand with the same patient care he had shown his wife years before, back when the whole arrangement between them had been nothing more than a business proposition between a widow and a wandering horse trader. Grace, 3 years old, sat nearby playing with a wooden horse that Matthew had carved for her, and baby Peter slept peacefully in a basket in the shade, and Eva found herself overwhelmed, in that ordinary evening moment, by the sheer improbable joy of the life she had built, or rather, the life that she and Matthew had built together, out of grief and stubbornness, and the particular alchemy that occurs when two wounded people find in each other. Not a replacement for what they lost, but a genuine and separate source of joy worth building a future around. "You're thinking too hard about something," Matthew said, glancing up from his lesson with Daniel, having caught the contemplative expression on his wife's face. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," Eva said, coming to sit beside him on the bench near the forge entrance, watching their son practice his careful, small hammer strikes on a scrap of iron. "7 years ago I stood at Daniel's grave and swore I would never depend on any man again. I thought that vow meant closing myself off entirely, building walls to keep myself safe from ever hurting like that again. And now?" Matthew asked, though his eyes told her he already understood. "Now I understand that the vow wasn't wrong exactly," Eva said. "I don't depend on you, Matthew, not in the way I might have feared depending on someone all those years ago. We built this together as equals, each of us bringing our own strength to it. But I also understand now that there's a difference between depending on someone and choosing to build a life alongside them. I didn't need you to save me. I had already saved myself, built something out of nothing with my own 2 hands. But I'm endlessly grateful that you rode into this yard anyway, with your 6 lame horses, and gave me the chance to build something even better than I could have built alone." Matthew reached over and took her hand, the same gesture he had made that night under the Wyoming stars when he had first told her he loved her, and Eva felt, as she always did at his touch, that particular warmth that had never diminished in all the years since, had if anything only deepened and grown more comfortable, the way a well-tended fire grows steadier and more reliable the longer it is fed. "I've been thinking too," Matthew said, "about all those years before I came here, all that drifting from town to town, telling myself I liked the freedom of it, the not staying anywhere long enough to lose anything. I understand now that I wasn't living, not really. I was just surviving, same as you were, in your own way, after Daniel died. It took both of us finding each other to understand the difference between merely surviving and actually building a life worth having." Their son Daniel, overhearing this last part of the conversation despite being absorbed in his hammer practice, looked up with the particular curiosity of a 6-year-old encountering adult conversation he did not fully understand. "Papa, were you sad before you came here?" Matthew considered the question with the seriousness he always gave to his children's inquiries, however simple they might seem. I was, son, though I didn't always know it at the time. Sometimes a person can be sad for a long while without understanding that's what's wrong with them. It took meeting your mother and seeing how she'd built something beautiful out of a terrible loss to understand that I wanted to build something too, instead of just wandering. I'm glad you stayed, Daniel said, with the simple directness of a child, and returned his attention to his hammer practice, evidently satisfied with this explanation. So am I, Eva said softly, watching her husband's face soften with emotion at their son's simple words. So am I, more than I could ever properly say. That evening, after the children had been fed and put to bed, Eva and Matthew sat together on the porch of the home they shared, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, the forge fire banked for the night. The horses settled quietly in the corral Matthew had built all those years ago in what had once been merely a business proposition, and had become, in time, the foundation of an entire family's life. Do you ever think about what might have happened, Eva asked, if you'd ridden on past Split Creek that summer, gone to Buffalo instead, never brought your horses to my forge? I try not to think about it, Matthew admitted. It seems to me like thinking too hard about a road not taken is a good way to miss appreciating the road you're actually walking. But if you're asking whether I believe there was something more than chance in how things worked out, I suppose I do believe that, in my own way. I don't know that I believe in fate, exactly, not in some grand predetermined sense. But I believe that sometimes, if a person keeps their eyes open and their heart willing, even after loss, even after grief that seems like it might never lift, the world has a way of bringing them exactly what they need, right when they're finally ready to receive it. Eva leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the first stars emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed his proposal all those years before. I was ready, she said, even before I knew I was ready. I think that's what frightened me most that first summer. Some part of me already knew, long before I was willing to admit it, that you were going to become important to me. That frightened me more than Bramwell's threats ever did. And now? Matthew asked. Now, Eva said, I can't imagine my life any other way. Now I understand that Daniel gave me a beginning, 6 good years, and a trade that saved my life when I needed saving most. But you, Matthew Warren, you gave me a whole future, a family, a partnership built on equal footing rather than dependence, and a love that grew slowly and honestly rather than being forced by circumstance. I wouldn't trade a moment of the pain that came before, because that pain led me, eventually, to this. To you, to all of this. Matthew kissed her then, gently, the same way he had kissed her on their wedding day. And Eva felt, as she always did, that particular sense of homecoming that had become the defining feeling of her life since Matthew Warren had ridden into her forge yard with 6 lame horses, and a proposition that had, against every expectation and every careful vow she had made at her first husband's graveside, become the foundation of a love story built not from whirlwind passion but from patient, steady partnership, forged, quite literally, in the fires of shared work and mutual respect. The years that followed continued in much the same vein, full of ordinary joys and occasional hardships, as all lives are, but always underlaid by the steady foundation of love that Eva and Matthew had built together. Their children grew, Daniel eventually taking over much of the blacksmithing trade himself as a young man, having inherited both his mother's skill with the hammer and his stepfather's easy way with horses. Grace grew into a spirited young woman who, much to the amusement of the town, insisted on learning to ride and trade horses herself, following in her father's footsteps with the same stubborn determination her mother had once shown in taking up the anvil. Peter, the youngest, developed a fascination with numbers and eventually became the one who managed the growing business's accounts, ensuring that the prosperity his parents had built through years of hard work continued to be properly tended and grown for future generations. Split Creek itself grew alongside them, from a small collection of buildings along an uncertain creek into a proper town with a schoolhouse, a second church, and eventually, by the late 1880s, even a small newspaper that occasionally featured stories about the town's most notable citizens. Among them the blacksmith widow who had rebuilt her life from ashes and the horse trader who had chosen, against all his old wandering instincts, to build a permanent home beside her. Eva Sawyer Warren lived to see her grandchildren grow up in that same forge yard, teaching them, as she had taught her own children, the particular satisfaction of honest work well done, the value of standing firm against injustice, whether it came in the form of a bullying landowner or the simple, everyday challenges of building a life in a hard and unforgiving territory. And Matthew Warren, who had once told himself he preferred a life of wandering to a life of standing still, never once regretted the day he had chosen to stay, to build something permanent, to trade the restless freedom of the open road for the deeper, richer freedom of a life, built in partnership with a woman whose strength had first caught his attention across a forge yard full of lame horses, and whose love had, in the years that followed, given his own restless heart the home it had been searching for all along. Their story, in the end, was not one of dramatic rescue or sweeping romantic gesture, though it contained moments of both danger and tenderness in equal measure. It was, instead, a story of two people who had each known loss, who had each learned, in their own ways, the particular courage required to keep living fully even after tragedy, and who had found, in each other, not an escape from their grief but a genuine partner for the long, difficult, ultimately joyful work of building a life worth living. It was a story that began, quite literally, in ashes, in the burned-out grief of a young widow standing alone at her husband's grave, and ended, decades later, in the warm glow of a forge fire tended by 3 generations of a family bound together not merely by blood, but by the deeper, harder-won bonds of chosen love, mutual respect, and the simple, steady determination to build something good out of whatever life happened to give them. And on quiet evenings, even in her later years, Eva would sometimes stand in the doorway of the forge that had once been her only lifeline in the darkest months of her life, and watch her children and grandchildren carrying forward the trade she had learned out of desperate necessity. And she would think, with a gratitude that never diminished across all the years, of that summer day when a stranger with kind eyes had ridden into her yard leading 6 lame horses, and had, without either of them quite realizing it at the time, ridden his way straight into the center of a life she had thought was already complete in its solitude, and had shown her, instead, exactly how much more a life could hold if a person was brave enough to let it.